The sound was almost nothing. A faint rustle, like linen fluttering in the dark. German soldiers called it the whisper of death. It came after midnight, riding the still air over the treetops. First silence, then a sudden thud, then fire. Bombs erupted from nowhere. Flames leapt into the sky. Before a searchlight could lock on, the aircraft were already gone, back into the black, swallowed by night. The men cursed, shouted, fired wildly into the dark. But they hit nothing. There were no engines to trace, no shadows to track. Only the soft sigh of wind. They weren't ghosts. They weren't witches. They were women, and they were real. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, Soviet women, flying canvas-winged biplanes from another era, dropping bombs with deadly precision. There were no male pilots in their regiment, no luxury of modern aircraft, no margin for error, just two-person crews, an open cockpit, and a war to win. They flew at night over forests and fields, across frozen rivers and battle-scarred villages. Their planes were little more than wooden frames with fabric skins, slower than most cars, vulnerable to even the lightest ground fire. But they flew anyway, night after night. This was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Forces. It began in the summer of 1941. Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. The German Wehrmacht stormed eastward, overwhelming Soviet defenses. Cities burned, civilians fled. Moscow braced for siege. The Soviet Union, though vast, was bleeding. As the Red Army reeled, the Soviet government issued a general call for volunteers. Everyone was needed: soldiers, nurses, drivers, and for the first time, women aviators. Enter Marina Raskova. She was already famous, a pilot, navigator, and national icon, often called the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She had set long-distance flight records and taught navigation to male military cadets. Now, she used her influence to push for something unprecedented: all-female combat aviation units. Stalin approved. In October 1941, 3 female regiments were formed: the 586th for fighter pilots, the 587th for heavy bombers, and the 588th, assigned the most dangerous task of all: night harassment bombing. Low altitude, close range, slow speed bombing runs over enemy territory. The women came from across the USSR: students, mechanics, farm girls, some barely 18. Many had never flown more than a glider. They trained under extreme pressure, enduring full combat preparation in just months. They learned to navigate by stars, to maintain their own aircraft, to fly under blackout conditions, and to land without lights or instruments. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, was a 2-seat biplane originally designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and training plane. It had a top speed of about 90 miles per hour. No radio, no armor, no gun. It was made of plywood and canvas, and in combat it was considered obsolete. But it had advantages. Its slow speed made it incredibly maneuverable. Its light frame let it fly low, just above treetops, where radar couldn't detect it. And at night, the pilots would kill the engine as they neared the target, gliding in silently before dropping their bombs. To those below, it was like death arriving on wings of smoke. A typical mission lasted only a few minutes. The crew would release 2 or 3 bombs, pull up sharply to avoid anti-aircraft fire, and vanish. Then another plane would come. Then another. Dozens of sorties in a single night, each attack precisely timed to deny the enemy any rest. The regiment worked in teams. One pair would act as bait, drawing searchlights and fire. The others would glide in under cover, drop their bombs, and escape. Then they'd switch. Pilots flew 6, 8, even 10 sorties per night. There was no sleep, just cold air, burning fuel, and adrenaline. They had no parachutes. The planes were too small. If a Po-2 was hit, The crew went down with it. But that didn't stop them. By late 1942, the Night Witches were flying regular missions along the southern front, supporting Soviet forces in the Caucasus, the Crimea, and later into Poland and Germany itself. They targeted German supply lines, artillery emplacements, and sleeping units. They burned fuel depots and wrecked rail yards. They were impossible to pin down and impossible to ignore. The Germans were furious. They began to spread rumors that the women were not women at all, but witches, drugged or possessed, given supernatural abilities to see in the dark. They claimed the Soviets had used black magic to train them. Some swore the planes were invisible. They weren't. They were just brave. The conditions were hellish. Winters on the Eastern Front were brutal. Temperatures in the cockpit often dropped below zero. There were no heaters, no insulation. Navigators had to tear the skin from their own fingers just to unstick them from frozen instruments. Pilots flew with scarves wrapped around their faces, teeth chattering as snow swirled through the open fuselage. Still they flew. There were heroes among them. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, their commander, maintained strict discipline and unwavering focus. She demanded perfection, not because she was harsh, but because mistakes meant death. Her leadership kept the regiment operational even as aircraft were destroyed and crews killed. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most famous pilots, completed 852 combat sorties. She was shot down multiple times. On one night alone, she flew 18 missions. Irina Sabrova flew over 1,000 sorties, many into areas so dangerous that entire airfields had been marked off-limits to other units. And there were losses. Yevgenia Rudneva, a gifted navigator and astronomy student, was killed when her plane was hit over Sevastopol. She was 23. Lydia Svistanova died in a fiery crash when her aircraft was mistaken for German by friendly fire. Some died in mid-air, others in training. A few, captured, were executed on the spot. But for every loss, another woman stepped up. The regiment continued flying until the end of the war. When Berlin fell, the Night Witches were still bombing targets, this time in German territory. Their aircraft were still Po-2s. Their uniforms were still hand-me-downs from male units. But their courage had never changed. In total, the 588th flew over 23,000 missions, dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs, and earned over 300 awards for valor. 32 of its pilots died in combat. 23 received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. And yet, after the war, they were largely forgotten. The Soviet Union moved on. Male veterans were celebrated. Monuments were built. The Night Witches returned to quiet lives, teachers, engineers, mothers. Some never flew again. For decades, their story lived in memory, passed between families, whispered over glasses of tea, remembered in silence. Then, slowly, the world remembered. Journalists found flight logs, letters, faded photographs. Survivors began to speak. Documentaries were made. Museums took notice. Western historians, once skeptical, began to recognize the regiment as one of the most effective night bombing units of the entire war. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because their homes were burning. Their brothers were dying. Their country was bleeding. They fought with canvas and courage, with silence and steel. And when the night came, when the winds howled and tracer fire lit the sky, they rose over and over into darkness. Not because they were witches, but because they refused to disappear. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.